The summer heat in Nashville was particularly unforgiving that July afternoon in 1997, the kind of oppressive humidity that made even the most seasoned Tennessee natives seek refuge in air-conditioned spaces. Vince Gill sat in his music room, a sanctuary he had carefully crafted over the years in his Belmead home, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his guitars and the gold records that lined the walls like soldiers standing at attention, each one representing a milestone in a career that had already spanned 2 decades of unprecedented success in country music. At 40 years old, he had reached what most observers would consider the absolute pinnacle of country music success, with multiple Grammy Awards, Country Music Association honors, and a string of #1 hits that had defined the sound of contemporary country music throughout the 1980s and 90s. Yet lately, something felt fundamentally different about his place in the industry, as if the ground beneath his feet was shifting like quicksand. The music landscape was undergoing a seismic transformation, and younger artists with a completely different aesthetic and musical philosophy were dominating the charts with a sound that felt increasingly distant from the traditional country music he cherished and had dedicated his entire professional life to preserving and advancing. His weathered fingers, calloused from decades of guitar playing and marked by the small scars that come from years of intense practice and performance, moved absently across the strings of his vintage 1953 Martin D28 guitar. This particular instrument had been his constant companion through countless late nights of songwriting and soul-searching, its rich mahogany back and sides producing the warm, resonant tone that had become his signature sound. The melody that emerged from his unconscious strumming seemed to carry the weight of his recent struggles with creative block and the mounting pressure from record label executives who were increasingly focused on commercial viability rather than artistic integrity. These executives, mostly younger men in expensive suits who spoke in marketing terms and demographic statistics, were constantly pushing him to produce something more commercially appealing, something that would capture the attention of the coveted 18 to 34 demographic that advertisers prized above all else. They wanted him to incorporate more pop elements into his sound, to work with producers who specialized in the glossy, highly produced style that was becoming increasingly dominant in Nashville recording studios. The personal upheaval in his life had only compounded these professional pressures. His marriage to Janice Oliver, one half of the country duo Sweethearts of the Rodeo, had ended 2 years prior in a painful and highly publicized divorce that had left him questioning not just his personal relationships, but his entire approach to balancing the demands of a high-profile career with the needs of family life. The divorce had been particularly difficult because it involved not just the end of a marriage, but the dissolution of a musical partnership that had produced some of his most beloved songs. Though he had found love again with Amy Grant, the Christian music superstar whose own career had been marked by similar industry pressures and personal challenges, the emotional upheaval had left him in a constant state of self-examination about his artistic direction and life priorities. Amy understood the unique pressures of being a recording artist in a way that few people could. But their relationship also brought additional complications, including scrutiny from both the country music and Christian music communities about the appropriateness of their romance. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of his music room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the humid air. The room was filled with the memorabilia of a remarkably successful career: platinum albums commemorating multi-million selling records, awards from the Country Music Association and the Academy of Country Music, and photographs capturing moments with legendary musicians like Chet Atkins, Emmylou Harris, and Ricky Skaggs. These artifacts served as tangible reminders of his achievements. Yet somehow they felt like relics from a different era, museum pieces from a time when musicianship and songwriting craftsmanship were valued above market research and focus group testing. The country music industry of the late 1990s was becoming increasingly focused on youth, sex appeal, and crossover potential, leaving traditional artists like Vince wondering if their brand of authentic, emotionally driven music still had a viable place in the modern marketplace. Radio programmers were becoming more conservative in their playlists, favoring artists who could appeal to multiple demographic groups and generate significant retail sales. The days when a song could become a hit based solely on its artistic merit and emotional resonance seemed to be rapidly disappearing. His contemplation was interrupted by the persistent ringing of his phone, the sharp electronic sound cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the music room, like an unwelcome intrusion from the outside world. The caller identification display showed his manager's number, and Tom Richardson's voice carried an unusual note of excitement as he explained an opportunity that had just come up through their extensive network of industry contacts and personal relationships built over years of successful collaboration. Tom had been Vince's manager for nearly a decade, and their partnership had been built on mutual respect and a shared commitment to artistic integrity. Unlike many music industry managers who were focused solely on maximizing short-term profits, Tom understood the importance of maintaining Vince's artistic credibility and long-term career sustainability. When he called with an opportunity, it was usually something worth serious consideration. A wealthy and influential family in Franklin, Tennessee, just 20 miles south of Nashville in the heart of Williamson County, was planning an elaborate wedding celebration for their daughter, and they had specifically requested Vince to perform at the reception. The Morrison family had been longtime supporters of country music, with the bride's father, Robert Morrison, being a successful businessman who had sponsored several high-profile Music Row events over the years and had served on the board of directors for the Country Music Hall of Fame. The fee being offered was substantial enough to make any artist take notice, but more importantly for Vince's current state of mind, it represented an opportunity to perform in an intimate setting where he could reconnect with his music on a personal level, away from the commercial pressures and industry politics that had been weighing heavily on his creative spirit. The personal nature of the request resonated with something deep inside him that had been missing from his recent high-profile performances. Tom explained that Sarah Morrison, the bride-to-be, had grown up attending the Grand Ole Opry with her grandfather, a retired music producer who had worked with some of Nashville's biggest stars during the golden age of country music in the 1970s and 80s. She had specifically requested Vince for her wedding, citing his songs as the soundtrack to her relationship with her fiancé, and expressing a desire to have authentic country music be part of her special day. The request touched something fundamental in Vince's artistic soul. Here was a young woman who had grown up appreciating the kind of music he had devoted his life to creating. Someone who understood the emotional power and cultural significance of traditional country music in a way that seemed increasingly rare among younger listeners. The opportunity to be part of such an important milestone in her life felt like a return to the fundamental purpose of music, to celebrate life's most meaningful moments and create lasting memories for people who truly appreciated the art form. Vince had always believed deeply and passionately in the power of music to bring people together, especially during life's most significant celebrations and transitions. Throughout his career, he had witnessed countless examples of how the right song at the right moment could transform an ordinary experience into something transcendent and unforgettable. Wedding performances were something he rarely accepted due to his busy touring schedule and the logistical challenges of adapting his full band setup to intimate venues. But something about this particular request struck a chord with his current need for artistic renewal and personal reconnection with his musical roots. Perhaps it was the chance to step away from the commercial pressures and industry expectations that had been gradually suffocating his creativity over the past few years. Maybe it was simply the appeal of performing for people who had actively chosen his music to be part of their love story, rather than passively consuming whatever the radio stations and record labels decided to promote. Whatever the underlying motivation, Vince found himself genuinely excited about the prospect of this intimate performance in a way that he hadn't felt about a show in many months. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday evening at a sprawling estate that had been in the Morrison family for 3 generations, a testament to old Tennessee money and the kind of generational wealth that had shaped the social and cultural landscape of Middle Tennessee for over a century. The property was located in the rolling hills of Williamson County, an area that had become increasingly popular with Nashville's entertainment industry elite due to its combination of rural beauty and proximity to the city's recording studios and music venues. As Vince made the drive from Nashville to Franklin that Saturday evening, he found himself taking the scenic route through the countryside, passing through small communities that seemed largely untouched by the rapid development that was transforming much of the greater Nashville area. The familiar landscape of Tennessee helped calm his pre-performance nerves and reminded him of the cultural roots that had shaped his musical identity from the very beginning of his career. The Morrison estate was even more impressive than Tom had described, accessible only through wrought iron gates that opened onto a long gravel driveway lined with ancient oak trees whose massive branches formed a natural canopy overhead. The main house was a magnificent example of antebellum architecture. Built in the 1800s and carefully restored to maintain its historical integrity, while incorporating modern amenities that allowed it to function as a comfortable family home and elegant entertainment venue. As Vince drove up the winding driveway, he was struck by the meticulous attention to detail that had gone into preparing the property for the wedding celebration. White roses and magnolia blossoms adorned every available surface, their sweet fragrance mixing with the humid Tennessee air to create an atmosphere of Southern elegance and romance that seemed perfectly suited to a traditional country music performance. The combination of natural beauty and careful cultivation created exactly the kind of setting where Vince felt most comfortable sharing his music. The reception was being held in a beautifully restored 19th century barn that had been converted into a sophisticated event space, while carefully maintaining its rustic charm and historical authenticity. The original wooden beams, weathered by decades of Tennessee weather and marked by the patina that only comes with age, now supported strings of vintage Edison bulbs that cast a warm golden glow over the assembled guests. The combination of historical authenticity and modern luxury created an atmosphere that was both elegant and comfortable, formal enough for a wedding celebration, but intimate enough for the kind of personal musical experience that Vince specialized in creating. The bride, Sarah Morrison, was a vivacious and intelligent 25-year-old whose deep love for traditional country music had been carefully nurtured from childhood by her grandfather, James Morrison, a retired music producer who had worked behind the scenes with some of Nashville's biggest stars during the genre's most creative and commercially successful period. James had instilled in Sarah an appreciation not just for country music's melodies and rhythms, but for its storytelling tradition and its ability to capture the authentic experiences of working-class Americans. Her new husband, David Wellington, represented a completely different cultural background and set of musical influences. David was a successful investment banker from Atlanta who had been raised in the urban, cosmopolitan environment of that rapidly growing southern metropolis. His musical tastes had been shaped by contemporary rock and pop, genres that he and his social circle considered more sophisticated and culturally relevant than what they privately regarded as the outdated and unsophisticated sounds of country music. The fundamental cultural divide between the bride and groom's backgrounds was reflected in their wedding guest list, which brought together two very different segments of American society in a way that was becoming increasingly common, but also increasingly fraught with potential for misunderstanding and conflict. On one side were the traditional country music fans, mostly from rural Tennessee and surrounding states, who had grown up with the Grand Ole Opry as a central part of their cultural identity, and who saw country music as an authentic expression of their values, struggles, and aspirations. These guests included farmers whose families had worked the same land for generations, small business owners who had built their enterprises through hard work and community support, and blue-collar workers whose daily experiences were reflected in the honest, straightforward lyrics of traditional country songs. For them, country music wasn't just entertainment. It was a cultural touchstone that connected them to their heritage and provided a sense of identity in an increasingly complex and rapidly changing world. On the other side were David's friends and colleagues from the financial world, urban professionals who had been educated at prestigious universities and who worked in glass-walled office buildings in major metropolitan areas. Their cultural references came from mainstream media, contemporary art, and the kind of sophisticated entertainment that was featured in upscale magazines and exclusive social venues. To many of them, country music represented everything they had been taught to reject about rural American culture, a quaint relic of a less sophisticated time that educated cosmopolitan people were supposed to have outgrown. As Vince began the process of setting up his equipment on the small stage that had been constructed at one end of the barn, he could immediately sense the mixed energy in the room and the underlying tension between these two very different groups of people. His years of experience performing for diverse audiences had taught him to read crowd dynamics quickly and accurately, and his practiced eye immediately identified the different factions among the guests and the potential for conflict that existed beneath the surface of polite social interaction. The stage setup was relatively simple compared to his usual concert productions, consisting of a high-quality sound system, professional lighting that had been carefully positioned to create an intimate atmosphere, and space for his guitars and other instruments. The technical crew hired by the Morrison family was clearly experienced and professional, and they worked efficiently to ensure that everything was properly connected and tested before the guests began to arrive in larger numbers. The older guests, particularly those from rural Tennessee and surrounding areas, were clearly excited to see him perform, and their enthusiasm was genuine and heartwarming. They approached him during the setup process with the kind of warmth and respect that had always been one of the most rewarding aspects of his career, sharing personal stories about how his music had provided comfort during difficult times, celebrated joyful occasions, and served as the soundtrack to their own love stories and family milestones. One elderly woman told him about how When I Call Your Name had been playing on the radio when she received news that her son had returned safely from military service overseas. A middle-aged man shared that I Still Believe in You had been the first dance song at his own wedding 15 years earlier. These personal connections to his music reminded Vince of why he had chosen this career path in the first place and reinforced his belief in music's power to create meaningful connections between people. However, Vince also noticed a group of younger guests, mostly David's friends and colleagues from Atlanta, who seemed considerably less enthusiastic about the evening's entertainment choices. Their body language suggested skepticism at best and outright hostility at worst, and they clustered together near the bar area, making comments that were just loud enough to be overheard by nearby guests, but not quite loud enough to be considered openly disrespectful or confrontational. Their designer suits, expensive watches, and perfectly styled hair marked them as successful members of the urban professional class, and their dismissive attitudes toward the musical selection reflected a broader cultural divide that was becoming increasingly pronounced in American society. The way they carried themselves suggested a sense of intellectual and cultural superiority that made them view the evening's entertainment as something to be endured rather than enjoyed. The reception began beautifully, with Vince opening his set with a carefully chosen selection of his most beloved and recognizable hits. His voice, rich and emotional after decades of professional training and performance experience, filled the barn as he performed When I Call Your Name, the song that had won him his first Grammy Award and established him as one of country music's premier vocal talents. The familiar melody seemed to transport many in the audience back to earlier times in their lives, evoking memories and emotions that connected them not just to the music, but to their own personal histories. His guitar work was particularly impressive during these opening songs, showcasing the technical skills and musical sensitivity that had made him one of the most respected musicians in Nashville. The vintage Martin guitar produced the warm, resonant tone that had become his signature sound, and his finger-picking technique demonstrated the years of practice and dedication that had gone into perfecting his craft. The audience response during these opening numbers was overwhelmingly positive, with couples moving onto the dance floor and guests of all ages singing along to lyrics they had memorized years earlier. The bride's family was clearly thrilled with the performance, their faces glowing with happiness and pride as they watched one of their musical heroes perform at their daughter's wedding. Even some of the initially skeptical guests seemed to be warming up to the experience, perhaps recognizing that regardless of their personal musical preferences, they were witnessing a master craftsman at work. His second song, I Still Believe in You, was dedicated specifically to the bride and groom, and its message of enduring love and commitment seemed perfectly suited to the occasion. The romantic lyrics and gentle melody created exactly the kind of atmosphere that the Morrison family had hoped for when they made the decision to hire live entertainment for the reception. Sarah Morrison was visibly moved as she danced with her new husband, clearly feeling that her musical dreams for the evening were being perfectly realized. For the first hour of the reception, everything proceeded exactly as Vince had hoped and as the Morrison family had planned. The music provided a perfect backdrop for the celebration, allowing guests to mingle, dance, and enjoy the carefully prepared food and drinks while being entertained by songs that had defined country music for nearly 2 decades. The atmosphere was relaxed and joyful, with multiple generations of family members sharing the dance floor and creating the kind of multi-generational celebration that had become increasingly rare in American society. The bride's grandfather, James Morrison, the retired music producer, approached Vince during a brief break between songs to express his heartfelt gratitude for the performance and to share some memories of the old days in Nashville when musicians like Vince were more common and more widely respected. James had worked with legendary artists like George Jones, Tammy Wynette, and Conway Twitty during his career, and he appreciated not just Vince's commercial success, but his dedication to maintaining the musical traditions that had made country music such an important part of American culture. However, as the evening progressed and the alcohol began to flow more freely among the guests, the atmosphere in the barn started to shift in subtle but increasingly noticeable ways. The group of David's college friends and business associates, who had been drinking steadily since the cocktail hour began, started to become more vocal in their criticism of the musical selection and their general disdain for country music as an art form. Their comments, which had started as whispered jokes and sarcastic observations among themselves, gradually became louder and more pointed as their inhibitions were lowered by alcohol consumption. They began making increasingly disparaging remarks about country music being hillbilly noise and questioning why they had to endure what they considered to be backward, unsophisticated entertainment that was beneath their cultural and intellectual standards. The shift in atmosphere was subtle at first, but experienced performers like Vince are trained to pick up on changes in audience energy, and he began to sense that something was developing that could potentially disrupt the evening's celebration. The tension in the room became increasingly palpable as other guests began to notice the hostile undercurrent that was emanating from one section of the crowd. The bride's family members exchanged worried glances as they became aware of the negative comments and dismissive attitudes being displayed by some of the groom's friends. Sarah Morrison herself looked increasingly uncomfortable as she realized that the wedding reception she had carefully planned was beginning to develop an unpleasant undercurrent of cultural conflict and social tension. David Wellington seemed genuinely torn between loyalty to his longtime friends and respect for his new wife's family and their musical traditions. His discomfort was evident in his body language as he tried to manage the increasingly difficult social dynamics without causing a scene that would ruin his wedding reception. The position he found himself in was particularly challenging because he was trying to maintain relationships with both groups while avoiding taking sides in what was becoming an increasingly obvious cultural clash. The situation reached a critical and potentially explosive tipping point when Vince made the decision to perform "Go Rest High on That Mountain," arguably his most personal and emotionally powerful composition. This song held profound significance for him on multiple levels, as he had written it as a tribute to his brother Bob, who had died unexpectedly of a heart attack at the age of 43, and to Keith Whitley, a fellow country musician and close personal friend who had succumbed to alcohol poisoning at the peak of his career. The song represented everything Vince believed about music's ability to heal emotional wounds, provide comfort during life's most difficult and painful moments, and create connections between people who had shared similar experiences of loss and grief. It was a deeply spiritual and emotional piece that showcased not just his vocal abilities, but his capacity for expressing profound human emotions through music. The haunting melody began to fill the barn, as Vince's voice soared through the emotional peaks and valleys of the song with a level of technical skill and emotional authenticity that demonstrated why he was considered one of country music's greatest vocal talents. His guitar work was particularly masterful during this performance, with each note seeming to carry the weight of genuine grief and hard-won wisdom about life's fragility and the importance of cherishing the time we have with the people we love. The song's message about finding peace in death and the hope of spiritual reunion in the afterlife resonated deeply with many in the audience, particularly the older guests who had experienced similar losses in their own lives and who understood the comfort that such music could provide during times of sorrow and mourning. The universal themes of love, loss, and hope that were woven throughout the lyrics created the kind of shared emotional experience that Vince had built his career on creating. A respectful and reverent silence fell over most of the crowd as the song progressed, with several guests becoming visibly moved by the raw emotion and spiritual depth of Vince's performance. The bride's grandmother wiped away tears as the music brought back memories of her own deceased husband, and other guests found themselves reflecting on their own experiences with loss, grief, and the healing power of music during difficult times. This was exactly the kind of transcendent moment that Vince lived for as a performer. The opportunity to create a shared emotional experience that brought people together in their common humanity and reminded them of the things that truly matter in life. The silence in the room was not empty but full of meaning, filled with the kind of collective reflection and emotional connection that only great art can inspire. But the group of intoxicated young men seemed to view this moment of vulnerability and emotional authenticity as an opportunity to assert their cultural superiority and demonstrate their intellectual sophistication by rejecting what they saw as maudlin sentimentality. To them, the earnest emotionalism of country music represented everything they had been educated to reject about rural American culture, a form of expression that sophisticated, educated people were supposed to have outgrown. Their urban, cosmopolitan backgrounds had taught them to view such displays of genuine emotion as unsophisticated and embarrassing, relics of a less enlightened time that modern, educated people should find outdated and irrelevant. The cultural programming they had received through their education and social experiences had created a mindset that equated emotional authenticity with intellectual inferiority. The first boo started quietly and tentatively, as if the perpetrators were testing the waters to see how their disruption would be received by the rest of the crowd. The initial sounds were almost hesitant, suggesting that even the troublemakers understood on some level that their behavior was inappropriate for the setting and the occasion. But when they realized that their behavior was shocking the other guests, rather than rallying them to their cause, they seemed to interpret this as evidence that they needed to be more aggressive in their cultural rebellion. The booing quickly grew louder and more confident, with the group of troublemakers apparently feeding off each other's energy and alcohol-fueled bravado. The sound of the booing cut through the gentle, sacred melody like a knife, creating a jarring contrast that made everyone in the room deeply uncomfortable and profoundly aware that something terrible was happening to what should have been a beautiful and meaningful moment. The disrespect was so unexpected and so completely inappropriate for both the setting and the emotional content of the song that other guests began to look around nervously, unsure of how to respond to such an unprecedented breach of basic social etiquette and human decency. Some of the older guests looked genuinely shocked and horrified, having never witnessed such behavior at a wedding reception or any other formal social gathering. The breach of etiquette was so severe that it seemed to violate not just social conventions, but basic principles of human respect and dignity. Vince's fingers continued to move across the guitar strings with professional precision, but his voice faltered slightly as the hostile reception registered in his consciousness and disrupted his emotional connection to the song. He had performed for millions of people throughout his career, faced tough crowds in honky-tonk bars where fights and disruptions were common, and dealt with professional criticism from music industry executives and journalists who were paid to be skeptical, but this felt fundamentally different from anything he had experienced before. This wasn't professional criticism based on artistic disagreement or commercial considerations. This was personal rejection of everything he stood for as an artist and as a human being. The attack felt particularly cruel, because it was directed not just at his music, but at a song that represented his most personal and painful experiences with loss and grief. The booing grew louder and more organized as the group of young men began to feed off each other's energy and encouraged each other to escalate their disruptive behavior. They started to chant for him to stop playing, calling for real music, and making increasingly disparaging and cruel comments about country music and the people who enjoyed such entertainment. Their behavior had moved far beyond simple musical preference or cultural disagreement into the realm of deliberate cruelty and cultural bullying. They were not just expressing their own tastes, but actively trying to humiliate and silence someone who was attempting to share something beautiful and meaningful with the assembled guests. The disruption was not only disrespectful to Vince, but also to the bride and groom, whose special day was being marred by this display of cultural elitism and personal cruelty. The wedding reception that Sarah Morrison had carefully planned as a celebration of her love for both her new husband and the music that had shaped her life was being turned into a battlefield of cultural conflict. The bride looked absolutely mortified as she watched her carefully planned wedding reception devolving into a cultural war zone that threatened to ruin not just the evening, but her memories of one of the most important days of her life. Her face flushed with embarrassment and anger as she realized that the celebration she had dreamed about for months was being destroyed by the thoughtless and cruel behavior of people who should have known better. David Wellington appeared increasingly agitated and conflicted, clearly torn between his loyalty to his longtime friends and his responsibility to his new wife and her family. The position he found himself in was impossible. Any action he took would damage important relationships and potentially make the situation even worse. Other guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats and gather their belongings as if preparing to leave, unwilling to be part of what was clearly going to be remembered as a disaster rather than a celebration. The magical atmosphere that had characterized the early part of the evening was rapidly dissolving into tension, hostility, and profound embarrassment for everyone involved. The bride's parents, Robert and Margaret Morrison, looked helpless and devastated as they watched their daughter's wedding reception being ruined by behavior that violated every principle of Southern hospitality and basic human decency. They were clearly torn between their desire to intervene and their uncertainty about how to address the situation without causing further disruption or making an already terrible situation even worse. As the hostile reaction intensified and showed no signs of abating despite the obvious distress it was causing to the bride and her family, Vince made the painful and difficult decision to stop performing. He carefully set down his guitar, treating the instrument with the respect it deserved even in this moment of professional humiliation, and stepped back from the microphone. He looked out at the crowd with an expression that mixed hurt, confusion, and profound disappointment, his professional composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of such unexpected and undeserved public humiliation. The barn fell silent except for the continued jeering from the small group of troublemakers, whose behavior had now crossed every line of acceptable social conduct. The silence that followed was deafening and filled with tension so thick it seemed almost physical. Some guests began to move toward the exits, uncomfortable with the conflict that had erupted and unwilling to be associated with what was clearly going to be a memorable evening for all the wrong reasons. Others stood frozen in place, unsure of how to respond to such an unprecedented situation, and afraid that any action they took might make things worse. Vince stepped back from the microphone, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of such unexpected and undeserved humiliation. This was supposed to be a celebration of love and unity, a joyful occasion where music would bring people together in shared happiness and create lasting memories of joy and connection. Instead, it had become a stark and painful reminder of the cultural divisions that were increasingly defining American society, and the lack of respect that many people now showed for artistic expression that didn't conform to their personal preferences or cultural prejudices. The rejection felt particularly acute and personally devastating because it came not from music critics or industry professionals, who might have had legitimate artistic disagreements or commercial concerns, but from ordinary wedding guests who had dismissed his life's work without even giving it a fair chance or showing basic human respect for the effort and emotion he was trying to share with them. The personal nature of the attack, combined with the inappropriate setting and the disrespect shown to the bride and groom on their wedding day, created a perfect storm of professional and personal humiliation that would have broken many performers and left them questioning their entire career and life choices. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, with the tension in the room becoming almost unbearable for everyone present. The bride began to cry, her carefully planned wedding reception now ruined by the thoughtless behavior of people who should have understood the importance of the occasion and shown appropriate respect for both the performer and the hosts. Her parents looked mortified and helpless, clearly embarrassed by their guests' behavior, but uncertain about how to address the situation without causing further disruption to what was already a complete disaster. The social dynamics in the room had become so toxic that any intervention seemed likely to make things worse rather than better. In that moment of profound personal and professional crisis, Vince felt the weight of every doubt he had been carrying about his career and his place in the rapidly changing music landscape. The industry pressures, the commercial expectations, the growing sense that his style of music was becoming obsolete in a world that valued youth and novelty over craftsmanship and authenticity. All of these concerns crystallized into a single, devastating moment of public rejection that seemed to confirm his worst fears about his relevance and value as an artist. The hostile young men continued their verbal assault, apparently emboldened by their success in silencing the performer and disrupting the celebration. They made increasingly crude and personal comments about country music, rural culture, and the people who enjoyed such entertainment. Their behavior had moved far beyond simple musical preference into the realm of cultural bigotry and deliberate cruelty. But as Vince stood there, facing the hostile crowd and processing the full magnitude of the humiliation he was experiencing, something unexpected and transformative began to happen. The oppressive silence was broken not by more jeering or by the sound of guests leaving in disgust, but by a single authoritative voice from the back of the room that cut through the tension like a sword of moral clarity. An elderly man, clearly one of the bride's relatives, began to speak in a voice that carried the weight of age, experience, and unshakable moral authority. The man was Sarah's great-uncle, Thomas Morrison, a World War II veteran who had spent his career as a high school principal in a small Tennessee town, dealing with difficult people and challenging situations for over 30 years before his retirement. His voice carried the kind of natural authority that comes from decades of leadership and moral courage, the voice of someone who had seen enough of life to understand what really mattered and who was not afraid to speak truth in difficult situations. He began to speak slowly and deliberately about respect, about the privilege of witnessing true artistry, and about the importance of honoring both the performer and the occasion with appropriate dignity and gratitude. Thomas Morrison's words were simple but powerful, delivered with the kind of moral clarity and conviction that seemed to shame the rowdy group into silence and force everyone in the room to confront the reality of what had just happened. He talked about the sacrifices that artists make to bring beauty and meaning into the world, about the years of practice and dedication required to master any craft, and about the courage it takes to stand in front of strangers and share something personal and vulnerable. He reminded the crowd that they were guests at a wedding, one of life's most sacred and joyful celebrations, and that their behavior was disrespectful not just to the performer, but to the bride and groom and their families who had opened their home and shared their special day with them. His words carried the weight of moral authority that comes from a life well lived and principles consistently applied. As the elderly man continued to speak, other guests began to nod in agreement, finding their own courage to stand up for what was right and to reject the cultural bullying that had poisoned the atmosphere. The bride's grandfather, James Morrison, the retired music producer, joined in with his own words of support, sharing stories about the respect that musicians deserved and the importance of preserving cultural traditions that connected people to their heritage and values. Several other guests began to speak up as well, creating a groundswell of support for both Vince and the values he represented. The moral tide in the room was turning, and the hostile minority found themselves increasingly isolated and morally indefensible. The courage of one person speaking truth had inspired others to find their own voices and stand up for basic principles of human decency and respect. The hostile group of young men, suddenly finding themselves outnumbered and morally isolated, began to look uncomfortable for the first time that evening. Their alcohol-fueled confidence began to evaporate as they realized that their behavior had not only failed to win them support, but had actually turned the majority of the crowd against them and exposed them as the cultural bullies they really were. The social dynamics in the room had shifted dramatically, and they found themselves on the wrong side of a moral divide that they had created through their own cruel and thoughtless behavior. The righteous anger of the other guests was palpable, and the troublemakers began to understand that they had crossed lines that should never have been crossed. Vince watched this transformation with a mixture of gratitude and renewed determination, feeling his faith in human goodness slowly beginning to return. The support from Thomas Morrison and other guests reminded him of something he had temporarily forgotten in the face of industry pressures and changing musical trends: that his music had always been about more than commercial success or critical acclaim. His art was about connecting with people who understood the power of authentic emotion and genuine craftsmanship, about creating moments of beauty and meaning in a world that often seemed devoid of both. The fact that a few intoxicated wedding guests didn't appreciate that connection didn't diminish its value for the many people who did understand and cherish it. The hostile reception from the small group of troublemakers said nothing about the quality of his music or his worth as an artist and human being. Instead, it revealed the character of those who had chosen to respond with such cruelty and disrespect to what should have been received as a generous gesture of musical sharing and celebration. With this realization, Vince felt his confidence and sense of purpose begin to return. The humiliation was still fresh and painful, but it was now tempered by a deeper understanding of what had actually happened and what it meant. He had not failed as a performer. He had simply encountered a group of people who were too immature, too intoxicated, and too culturally prejudiced to appreciate what they were being offered. The elderly man's intervention had reminded Vince of the fundamental purpose of his music and his responsibility as an artist to continue sharing his gifts regardless of how they were received by any particular audience. The support from other guests had shown him that there were still people who valued authentic artistic expression and who were willing to stand up for those values when they were threatened by ignorance and cruelty. He picked up his guitar again, but instead of launching into another song or walking away from the situation entirely, he made a decision that would define not just the rest of the evening, but the rest of his understanding of what it meant to be an artist and a human being. He began to speak to the crowd in a voice that was steady and calm, completely free from any trace of defensiveness, anger, or bitterness despite the humiliation he had just endured. His words came from a place of deep wisdom and hard-earned understanding about the nature of art, humanity, and the power of music to transcend even the most difficult circumstances. He talked about music as a universal language that could bring people together across cultural and generational divides, but only if they were willing to listen with open hearts and minds, setting aside their prejudices and preconceptions to experience something genuine and authentic. He shared personal stories about the songs he had written, the life experiences that had inspired them, and the thousands of letters he had received over the years from fans who had found comfort, healing, and meaning in his music during their own difficult times. His words were vulnerable and personal, but they carried the weight of genuine conviction and the authority that comes from a life dedicated to artistic truth and emotional authenticity. He wasn't defending his music so much as explaining why it mattered to him and to the millions of people who had embraced it as part of their own life stories. He spoke about the responsibility that comes with being given musical gifts and the obligation to use those gifts to create beauty and meaning in a world that desperately needed both. As he spoke, the room grew increasingly quiet, with even the group that had been heckling him seeming to listen with something approaching respect and understanding. Perhaps they were beginning to recognize for the first time that they were in the presence of a true artist who had dedicated his entire life to his craft and who had touched the lives of countless people through his commitment to musical excellence and emotional honesty. When Vince finished speaking, he made a decision that would completely transform the atmosphere of the evening and demonstrate the true power of grace under pressure. Instead of returning to his prepared set list or leaving the venue entirely, he asked the audience to suggest songs, not just his own hits, but any music that held special meaning for them or that they would like to hear performed in this intimate setting. The response was immediate, enthusiastic, and transformative. Guests began calling out requests for everything from classic country standards to contemporary pop songs to traditional hymns and folk ballads. The diversity of the requests reflected the varied musical tastes and backgrounds of the crowd, but more importantly, it demonstrated that people were willing to engage with music outside their usual preferences if it was presented with skill, respect, and genuine emotion. What followed was an extraordinary musical journey that completely transformed the atmosphere of the reception and created an experience that none of the guests would ever forget. Vince demonstrated his incredible versatility and musical knowledge as he moved seamlessly between different styles and genres, proving that great musicianship transcends artificial boundaries and that talent and authenticity can bridge even the deepest cultural divides. He performed classic country standards like Your Cheatin' Heart and Crazy with the respect and understanding they deserved, but also tackled Beatles songs like Yesterday and Here Comes the Sun, adapting each one to his unique style while maintaining the original spirit and emotional content of the music. His guitar work was particularly impressive, showcasing techniques and influences that drew from blues, jazz, folk, and rock traditions. The hostile group that had initially booed him found themselves reluctantly but genuinely impressed by his technical skill, musical knowledge, and professional grace. When he flawlessly performed a complex guitar solo on a Led Zeppelin song they had requested as a deliberate challenge, their attitude began to shift from antagonism to grudging respect, and eventually to genuine admiration. They were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing country music, but experiencing the work of a master musician who happened to specialize in country, but whose abilities and understanding extended far beyond any single genre. The artificial boundaries they had created in their minds between sophisticated and unsophisticated music began to dissolve as they witnessed the skill and artistry required to perform any music well. As the evening progressed and Vince continued to demonstrate his musical versatility and professional grace, the divide between different musical tastes and cultural backgrounds began to disappear entirely. Guests who had arrived with strong preferences for specific genres found themselves singing along to songs they had never heard before, but somehow understood on an emotional and spiritual level. The power of live music, performed with skill, passion, and genuine respect for the art form, was working its transformative magic on the crowd. Cultural prejudices and social divisions seemed to melt away in the face of authentic artistic expression and the shared human experience of being moved by beautiful music, performed with excellence and integrity. The bride and groom, who had been devastated when they thought their wedding reception was ruined beyond repair, began to relax and enjoy what was becoming a truly unique and memorable celebration. Instead of the disaster they had feared, they were witnessing something extraordinary. A masterclass in musical communication, human dignity, and the power of grace under pressure that would give them a story to tell for the rest of their lives. Vince's performance evolved from simple wedding reception entertainment into something much more profound and meaningful. A demonstration of music's power to heal divisions, create unexpected connections, and bring out the best in people, even in the most challenging and difficult circumstances. His willingness to engage with hostility through grace, to remain professional in the face of cruelty, and to adapt his performance to meet the audience where they were, showed the true mark of both a master artist and a genuinely good human being. The transformation was most evident and remarkable in the group that had initially booed him off the stage. By the end of the evening, several of them had approached him personally to apologize for their behavior and to express their genuine admiration for both his musical abilities and his gracious response to their inexcusable disrespect. They admitted that they had prejudged his music without really listening to it or understanding the skill and emotion that went into its creation. They confessed that their behavior had been motivated more by cultural prejudice and alcohol-fueled bravado than by any legitimate artistic criticism. One young man, who had been among the loudest and most aggressive hecklers, even asked for an autograph, confessing that he had never realized how much talent, dedication, and genuine artistry went into country music. The bride and groom were overwhelmed with gratitude for what Vince had accomplished through his grace and professionalism. What could have been a complete disaster that would have haunted their memories forever had become the highlight of their wedding reception, a story they would tell for decades to come, about the night a famous musician turned a moment of cultural conflict into a celebration of unity, understanding, and the transformative power of authentic artistic expression. Sarah Morrison told Vince that his response to the difficult situation had taught her something invaluable about grace under pressure. The importance of staying true to one's values even when faced with opposition and hostility, and the power of responding to cruelty with kindness and professionalism. The lesson would stay with her for the rest of her life and influence how she dealt with challenges and conflicts in her marriage and career. As the reception finally wound down in the early hours of the morning, guests continued to approach Vince to thank him for what had been an extraordinary and transformative evening. Many of them commented that they had never experienced anything quite like it. A live music performance that had challenged their preconceptions, introduced them to new musical possibilities, and demonstrated the power of art to transform even the most difficult situations into opportunities for growth, understanding, and human connection. The drive back to Nashville that night was quiet and contemplative, but it was filled with a sense of resolution and renewed purpose that had been missing from Vince's life for many months. The creative block that had been plaguing him seemed to have lifted completely, and he found himself mentally composing new songs inspired by the evening's events and the lessons he had learned about grace, forgiveness, and the transformative power of maintaining one's integrity in the face of adversity. The experience had given him new material to work with, but more importantly, it had restored his confidence in his artistic vision and his faith in music's power to make a positive difference in people's lives. He realized that true artistic success wasn't measured by universal approval or commercial achievement, but by the ability to remain authentic and gracious in the face of criticism, and to use one's talents as a force for understanding, healing, and human connection. The wedding performance became a defining moment in Vince's understanding of his role as an artist and his responsibility to use his gifts to make the world a better place. The humiliation he had faced that night had ultimately led to a deeper understanding of his purpose and a stronger commitment to the values that had guided him throughout his career. He learned that the greatest victories often come not from avoiding challenges, but from meeting them with courage, grace, and an unwavering commitment to one's artistic truth and human dignity. In the weeks and months that followed that transformative evening in Franklin, word of the wedding performance spread throughout the Nashville music community like wildfire, taking on an almost legendary quality that grew with each retelling. Other musicians heard the story through the industry grapevine and were deeply inspired by Vince's professional response to what could have been a career-damaging situation. The incident became a powerful teaching moment about the importance of respecting all forms of artistic expression and the incredible power of music to bridge even the deepest cultural divides when presented with skill, authenticity, and genuine respect for the audience. The story was eventually picked up by several prominent music industry publications, with seasoned journalists and critics praising Vince's extraordinary grace under pressure and his remarkable ability to turn a potentially devastating hostile situation into a triumph of musical communication and human understanding. Music writers who had covered the industry for decades said they had never witnessed such a masterful demonstration of professionalism and artistic integrity in the face of deliberate provocation and public humiliation. The incident quickly became part of country music folklore, joining the ranks of legendary stories about how great artists had overcome adversity and demonstrated the true meaning of professionalism and artistic commitment. It served as a powerful reminder that great art often emerges from moments of difficulty and challenge, and that the true test of an artist's character and worth comes not in how they handle success and acclaim, but in how they respond to rejection, criticism, and public humiliation. The experience also had a profound and lasting impact on Vince's subsequent career choices and artistic development, fundamentally changing how he approached his craft and his relationship with his audience. He began to actively seek out more opportunities to perform in intimate settings where he could connect directly with audiences on a personal level and share not just his music, but the stories behind his songs and the experiences that had shaped his artistic vision. He realized that some of his most meaningful and transformative performances often happened not in large arenas filled with thousands of screaming fans or on television stages watched by millions of viewers, but in smaller venues where genuine human connection was possible and where music could work its most powerful magic on both performer and audience. These intimate performances allowed him to rediscover the fundamental joy and purpose that had originally drawn him to music as a young man. The wedding performance had taught him that his responsibility as an artist extended far beyond simply entertaining people or achieving commercial success. He came to understand that he had an obligation to educate, to challenge preconceptions and cultural prejudices, and to use his platform and influence to promote understanding and respect between different groups of people who might otherwise never find common ground. This newfound sense of purpose led him to become more involved in educational initiatives and cultural exchange programs that used music as a bridge between different communities and backgrounds. He began visiting schools in both urban and rural areas, talking to young people about the importance of respecting different forms of artistic expression and the value of keeping an open mind when encountering unfamiliar cultural traditions. He also started participating in cross-cultural musical collaborations that brought together artists from different genres and backgrounds, creating opportunities for mutual learning and artistic growth that might not have existed otherwise. These projects allowed him to continue expanding his own musical horizons while demonstrating to others the artificial nature of the boundaries that often separate different musical styles and cultural expressions. The transformation in Vince's approach to his career was noticed and appreciated by his fellow musicians, many of whom began to seek his advice about how to handle difficult performance situations and maintain artistic integrity in the face of commercial pressures. He became known not just for his musical abilities, but for his wisdom and guidance about the deeper meaning and responsibility that comes with being given artistic gifts. The young men who had booed him that night in Franklin eventually grew up and matured, and several of them later became genuine country music fans who shared the story of that evening with their own children as a lesson about the importance of keeping an open mind and showing respect for artistic expression, even when it falls outside their personal preferences. They came to understand that their behavior that evening had been not just disrespectful and cruel, but genuinely harmful to their own cultural education and personal growth. One of the former hecklers, who had been particularly aggressive in his disruption of the performance, eventually became a successful businessman who used his wealth and influence to support arts education programs in urban schools. He often told people that his transformation began that night at the Morrison wedding, when he witnessed firsthand the power of responding to hostility with grace and professional excellence. Another member of the group went on to become a music teacher who specialized in introducing young people from different cultural backgrounds to the full spectrum of American musical traditions. He credited Vince's performance and response to their hostile behavior as the moment when he first began to understand the narrow-mindedness and cultural prejudice that had shaped his earlier attitudes about music and art. The bride and groom's marriage not only lasted for decades, but was strengthened by the lessons they had learned that night about handling conflict with dignity and finding strength in adversity. Sarah and David Wellington often credited their wedding reception with teaching them fundamental principles about respect, tolerance, and the power of art to bring people together, even in the most challenging circumstances. They made it a family tradition to attend live music performances of all kinds, from classical concerts to jazz festivals to country music shows, teaching their children to appreciate the skill and dedication required to master any musical art form. The story of their wedding reception became a family legend that was passed down to their children and grandchildren as an example of how to respond to difficult situations with grace and how to recognize and appreciate authentic artistic expression. Sarah Wellington, the former Sarah Morrison, eventually became a patron of the arts who used her family's wealth and social connections to support emerging musicians from all genres and backgrounds. She established a scholarship fund specifically designed to help young artists from rural areas pursue formal musical education and career development opportunities that might otherwise be unavailable to them. The Morrison family estate in Franklin, where the wedding had taken place, eventually became a venue for regular musical performances and cultural events that brought together people from different backgrounds and musical traditions. The beautifully restored barn where Vince had faced his moment of trial became a symbol of music's power to overcome division and create understanding between people who might otherwise remain separated by cultural prejudices and social barriers. A small plaque was eventually installed near the stage area of the barn, commemorating the night when Vince Gill had turned a moment of cultural conflict and personal humiliation into a powerful demonstration of music's unifying power and the importance of responding to hostility with grace and professional excellence. The plaque served as a reminder to future performers that the greatest victories often come not from avoiding challenges and difficulties, but from meeting them with courage, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to one's artistic truth and human values. The venue became a popular destination for wedding receptions and other celebrations, with many couples specifically requesting to hold their events there because of the inspiring story associated with the location. The barn's reputation as a place where art had triumphed over ignorance and grace had overcome hostility made it a symbol of hope and possibility for people who believed in music's power to make the world a better place. For Vince Gill himself, the experience marked the beginning of a new and more fulfilling chapter in his career, one defined not by commercial pressures or industry expectations, but by a renewed and deepened commitment to using his musical gifts to create moments of genuine human connection and understanding. The humiliation and pain he had faced that night had ultimately led to a more profound understanding of his purpose as an artist and a stronger commitment to the values and principles that had guided him throughout his life and career. The creative renaissance that followed the wedding performance produced some of the most meaningful and artistically successful music of Vince's entire career. Songs inspired by the experience and the lessons it had taught him resonated with audiences who were hungry for authentic artistic expression and genuine emotional connection in an increasingly artificial and commercially driven entertainment landscape. The incident became a touchstone for discussions about artistic integrity, cultural respect, and the responsibility that comes with being given musical talents. Music educators began using the story as a teaching tool to help young artists understand the importance of maintaining professionalism and grace even in the most difficult and challenging circumstances. The legacy of that evening in Franklin, Tennessee, extended far beyond the immediate participants and became part of the larger cultural conversation about art, respect, and the power of music to bridge differences and create understanding between people from different backgrounds and perspectives. It served as a powerful reminder that true artistic success is measured not by commercial achievement or critical acclaim, but by the ability to touch people's lives in meaningful ways and to use one's gifts to make the world a more beautiful, understanding, and connected place. The story continues to inspire musicians and artists of all kinds who face their own moments of challenge and adversity, reminding them that the greatest triumphs often emerge from the most difficult circumstances, and that responding to hostility with grace and authentic artistic expression can transform not just individual situations, but entire communities and cultural conversations. The wedding performance in Franklin became a testament to the enduring power of music to heal, unite, and elevate the human spirit, even in the face of ignorance, prejudice, and deliberate cruelty.